Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. Ad-free listening is available on Amazon Music for all the music plus top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/news ad free. That's amazon.com/news ad free to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Finding your perfect home was hard, but thanks to Burrow, furnishing it has never been easier. Burrow's easy-to-assemble modular sofas and sectionals are made from premium, durable materials, including stain and scratch-resistant fabrics. So they're not just comfortable and stylish, they're built to last. Plus, every single Burrow order ships free right to your door. Right now, get 15% off your first order at burrow.com/ACAST. That's 15% off at burrow.com/ACAST.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
Argumentative, you could say that. He had very little respect for the authority of his parents.
Welcome to the Power Test. I'm Ayesha Hazarika.
And I'm Sam Freedman.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Power Test. We are going to be focusing on all things defence and geopolitical, and we have very, very special guests, don't we, Sam?
We do. We have someone I know fairly well, my business partner on the Substack that I do, also my father.
Nepo baby alert. Nepo baby alert.
He does actually, he's not just my dad. We're not just getting on like my dad, the accountant or something. He does know the issue. He's a professor of war studies, has advised many governments on defence and foreign policy over the years, was a member of the Iraq inquiry into the sort of failings of the Iraq war, and also wrote the official history of the Falklands War. So does actually know what he's talking about on this stuff.
Yeah. But mainly we've got him on because we do want to get some embarrassing stories about wee Sam and what nightmare wee Sam was.
Yeah, I think we should focus mainly on geopolitics, but we might have
boring. Boo.
But having somebody doing what he did when I was growing up was pretty cool. And it certainly triggered a lot of my interest in history and politics that has sort of ended up with me being where I am now. When I was about 14 and he was working on the official history of the Falklands War, we had a school homework where we had to find a history source to bring into class to talk about. And I went into his room and picked up a load of documents off the top of a pile without telling him that he'd taken from the cabinet office to write the official history, which had top secret all over them in big letters. And were still covered under the Official Secrets Act because he was being given permission to see these documents. And I took them into history class and my history teacher absolutely freaked out. He will confirm this happened.
Was he like, none of us want to get arrested?
Yes, please could you not talk about these documents in a GCSE history class?
But look, we've been wanting to focus on defence and foreign policy for quite some time. It's an incredibly big issue. I think there's a general consensus. There's this idea of a peace dividend is sort of over right now because there's so much going on. But also there's been some quite interesting developments just this week, Sam, in terms of defence spending.
Yeah, so we had the Prime Minister announce that they were committing to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030-31, which is a fair time away. It comes after a similar-ish pledge from Labour, although they were vaguer about the timescale. They just said when resources allow. I mean, the challenge both parties have is how you pay for that. It's about £20 billion. What was so frustrating to me about the way the government did the announcement is they pretended it was a lot more money. They claimed it was £75 billion. They just did that by pretending that we just kept it the same in cash terms and then just added up the difference between now and 2030 and came up with this massive overinflated number. But then when they asked how they were going to pay for the real number, which is about 20 billion, they just said, oh, we're going to cut the civil service. And it's just ridiculous. These are big numbers. The civil service, in total costs about 16 billion. So you can't just pay for it with efficiencies or cutting a few civil servants. They are not engaging with the big trade-offs. If you're going to spend more on defence, and we may well need to spend more on defence, then you either need to put taxes up, borrow more money, or cut something else. And they're not willing to say they're going to do any of those things, and neither, for that matter, are Labour. So what we're getting into is an election where we're building up on both sides more and more promises, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's spending commitments, with no acknowledgement of the fiscal position we're in. So in a way, this is easier for the Conservatives to do because they're not going to be the ones who have to deal with the consequences. They're not going to be in government.
The thing that I thought was really interesting about this is that the principle is, I think, probably a good one, given where things are with defence. So the government goes ahead and makes, an announcement that lots of people will think, yeah, that's quite a good idea, and yet has no means of funding. I mean, how many times are you going to cite efficiencies from the civil service as a way to pay for everything? And it kind of made me think you've got this kind of through the looking glass situation where it feels like a Conservative government, which has historically prided itself on fiscal responsibility, can now just make kind of mad spending commitments without really explaining where the money's coming from, by just going efficiencies, we're just going to somehow like disappear the civil service, or, even talk about getting rid of national insurance. If a Labour government, or even a Labour opposition party, I mean, obviously we've had the Jeremy Corbyn years, if they suddenly came out with a completely massive amount of spending with no evidence of where the money would come from, everyone would just be aghast. But it's just like, this is the new normal.
And I don't like going on about the media all the time. I mean, I think the biases and so on can be overdone. But the reality is, if you compare the coverage to the announcement yesterday, which was broadly positive, I'd say, including from the broadcasters and so on, not just from the Tory papers, with the endless questioning of Labour making a similar unfunded commitment on green spending, 28 billion on green spending, there really is a double standard there. Labour were hammered every day. How are you going to pay for this? How are you going to pay for this? Until they drop the commitment. The Tories make a similar announcement, similar amount of money with no credible plan, and it's just accepted that they can do it.
All bodes well for the general election campaign, doesn't it?
I'm just going to get more and more angry as we get closer and closer, more and more annoyed.
Okay, let's now talk to your very, very clever father about all of these big issues. Well, I mean, I don't really know how to begin this interview, really. I feel like I'm intruding on a private family gathering. I mean, we've heard a lot about Nepo babies and famous father and son collaborations. I've just been casting my eye. We've had Will and Jaden Smith. They star together in After Earth. We've had Kiefer and Donald Sutherland, great dynasties coming together. And let's not forget political dynasties, Stanley and Boris Johnson. So we're
Oh, great. Thanks, Ayesha.
So we're following in that great tradition, and a very, very warm welcome to Lawrence Freedman, who, of course, is an eminent professor of war studies and a great thinker in terms of geopolitics. But most importantly, he's Sam's dad. Welcome.
I'm very pleased to be here.
We do want to talk to you about geopolitics because all that stuff is really, really important. But I think the primary reason you're really here is to tell us some embarrassing stories about Sam growing up. Was Sam always like this, Lawrence?
Always like what exactly?
What you see is what you get. I was very angelic as a boy. He would do everything asked of him immediately, wouldn't be stubborn. You can imagine. He was a challenging child. I'll say no more than that. I'll tell you one story, and then we should talk about geopolitics. When he was 8, we went to Italy on a holiday, and I was reviewing some books on the Second World War, including Martin Gilbert's extremely long history of the Second World War. So this small child, he was small then, picked up this very large book and started reading it with various people, including a number of Germans watching on, occasionally exclaiming, "Oh, they've invaded Belgium now." So we had an idea he was a little bit precocious even then.
I bet you're such a nightmare, Sam. Well, look, as much as we would love to delve into a sort of a trip down memory lane, poor Sam is looking so, can I just say he's looking so uncomfortable at this point. Sam, I'm just grateful that my dad is neither famous and he can barely speak English, so there, but for the grace of God. We'll get him on another time. We'll get him on the NHS at some point. Let's move on to the real reason why we have Lawrence here, because you are an absolute kind of eminent thinker on geopolitics. geopolitics is taking up so much airtime. We had this very, very long period really where, we knew geopolitics was important, and every so often we'd give a bit of lip service to it, but now it's just dominating the headlines all the time. I know from the work that I do on broadcasting, Lawrence, it's a big issue. Just to start big picture, I was really struck by the tone of many world leaders of late. And recently, the tone has been very much, we're in a kind of pre-war era at the moment. There's war in Ukraine, there's war in the Middle East, but there is a feeling that something bigger is imminent. There's a real anxiety about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's helpful to talk about it being pre-war, because that suggests there's an inevitable conclusion to the situation that we're in, and I don't think that's the case. I do think it's as difficult a time as I can remember. What's going on between Russia and Ukraine is very serious. I mean, we haven't had a war like that in Europe basically since the Second World War. And we don't quite know how this is going to end. And some of the endings are more dangerous than others. Plus the fact there's lots of other wars that are almost sort of background noise, but are still as deadly as anything else that's going on. For example, in Sudan and elsewhere in Africa. There is a lot of it about. It is dangerous. And there is a sense that the institutions and the mechanisms that would have calmed things down in the past, that would have helped manage crises better, aren't working as well anymore, because great power relations are in a poor state.
So in this sort of these questions about war footing and sort of being in this pre-war state, that the sort of Prime Minister's announcement this week about defence spending sort of came out promising 2.5%. Do you think it's enough?
The position before was that this was an aspiration, but the Chancellor said when economic conditions are right, and there's obviously an issue as between economic conditions and political international conditions. Basically, the problem that the Ministry of Defence had got itself into was that the amount of money they need for the projects they've got ongoing isn't sufficient. And this just about gets you there without a major crisis.
And Lawrence, what is Britain's standing in the world when it comes to particularly military issues at the moment? Will the rest of the world be looking at Britain right now and thinking, because of this announcement, we've really got to take Britain seriously?
By and large, the way that Ukraine has been handled in Europe means that the UK is a serious player. The UK was moved first before the full-scale invasion in providing defensive equipment to Ukraine. It's taken initiatives on long-range missiles, on tanks and so on. Yet the backup, certainly on tanks, comes from others. So I think it's played with a limited capability, but more substantial than others in Europe. It's got quite a lot out of it, extracted quite a lot out of it. In Asia, again, there's been quite a lot done with South Korea, with Japan, with Australia, with AUKUS, the submarine deal, which again are big deals. But there's still a question of what actually could the UK commit if push came to shove, if there was a big confrontation. And problems that we've had with the two big carriers breaking down too often, with delays in getting aircraft for these carriers and so on, with the army being cut back and having trouble with recruitment. These point in the opposite direction and raise questions about what sort of strength there really is behind the claims and the rhetoric.
And obviously the nuclear deterrent has been a sort of important part of Britain's ability to punch above its weight. But even on that, there are now concerns about whether it works. The last couple of tests haven't gone well. Is it an actual independent deterrent, or are we in fact really just dependent on America? In
some ways, it's become, again, politically more important because of doubts about Trump. One of the arguments always against having an independent deterrent was, well, we've got the Americans, why do we need our own? But if you're not sure about the Americans, then that argument becomes more important. With Trump, the difficulty is everything goes through his own narcissistic instinct. So I think one of the things Putin is worried about with Trump is that Trump's peace plan, which is not a surprising one, basically confirming Crimea and the Donbass to Russia, isn't as much as Putin wants. So if Putin was presented with this peace plan, said, no, I want more, you can never be sure how Trump will respond. The best assumption is that basically doesn't want to get entangled in other people's quarrels and fights. He's an isolationist by instinct. But around Europe, there is real concern. Not that he'll put pressure on Europeans to raise defence spending, another factor with the Prime Minister's announcement, but that he may just not want to be involved in NATO at all and disengage. The problem for the Europeans is they don't really have an alternative. I mean, the EU can't compensate for this, so they're going to have to try to make NATO work and hope that Trump's a blip, if he does get in, which is thankfully not absolutely certain.
And if he does get in, then that will be happening probably around the same time that Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister. We expect Keir Starmer to become Prime Minister here. And this is a sort of world that Labour are going to have to be dealing with. They haven't said all that much about foreign policy because it's not something that tends to win elections one way or another, unless maybe you're actually in a war. But they have talked a bit about it recently, and David Lammy recently sort of wrote a very long essay on what they call progressive realism as an approach to foreign policy. Where do you think they are in terms of sort of figuring out how they're going to deal with all of these problems?
Lammy has said that he would talk to Republicans, that the relationship doesn't just depend on who's in charge at one particular time. There isn't a lot of difference between Labour's defence and foreign policy and the Conservatives' defence and foreign policy. This is partly because Starmer was keen to distinguish himself from Corbyn, who undoubtedly would have been taking very different positions on the current situation on all of its aspects. But it was also because actually what Russia has done in Ukraine is pretty clear that it had to be resisted. It's not as if anybody in the United States or elsewhere is expecting a big shift in British policy as a result of a new government. So they're not very interested in it. They'll just assume that there'll be continuity. That, I think, probably works to Starmer's advantage because his domestic agenda is going to be pretty large when he gets in, and rows about foreign policy is probably the last thing he'd want while he's trying to get himself settled in.
Do you think there's any distinction between the sort of Conservative and Labour positions? I mean, certainly Labour have tried to present that there is some difference, particularly in terms of their attitude perhaps towards the next tier of unaligned countries sort of coming through now as being important in geopolitics and treating them with a bit more respect maybe and their concerns a bit differently.
Yes, but you'll find that in the integrated review as well. I don't think that there genuinely is an awful lot of difference. I mean, there's plenty to criticise and say you need to address in the Ministry of Defence. You can put more emphasis on diplomacy, the whole issue of the quotes unquote global south. All of these things are things that are on the agenda, but they're not going to change AUKUS, for example. Now, it may be that AUKUS has problems because it's a very demanding programme. So there's always going to be issues that will come up that they'll look back and say, well, the Tories set us up for that one, didn't they? But that's different from big issues of principle.
It feels like these big geopolitical tensions and conflicts are just not going to disappear, when there's the next UK election, and that these issues are going to continue being very, very difficult for whoever is in power after the next general election. We assume it will be Labour going by the polls. Labour historically has always had more tension with foreign policy issues. The Conservatives have got lots of issues they're conflicted on at the moment. There's more unity on foreign policy, on military action. For Labour, it's a much more torturous issue. We've seen it with the developments on Gaza. Lawrence, how do you think Keir Starmer and whoever is Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary navigate the fact that, as you say, they have tacked pretty closely to the Conservatives on everything so far? There's no signs that that's going to change when they come into power, but they will have a big backlash from within their own side. How do you think they navigate that?
Gaza is obviously the most difficult. And while one would hope that we've moved on to trying to do something about the situation in Gaza and reconstruction by the time of the election, that can't be guaranteed. And I think a Labour government would be under enormous pressure to take a hard line and put pressure on Israel. But Cameron's been doing that. I mean, Cameron toughened up the UK stance and he's been quite blunt in some of his statements. Now, Starmer might go further than that, but that's the direction of Western policy. So the Middle East is always going to be a particularly difficult one. If there hadn't been Ukraine, the big issue in transatlantic relations will be China. Washington is far more preoccupied with China than Europeans, who accept the security challenges, but still want to do business with China and so on. That's where the progressive realism will be put under some challenge, because the Labour government will also want to do business with China, but will say, we're aware of the security concerns. We know all about TikTok and so on. I think it'll carry on, but it'll become much more intense if we don't have Russia-Ukraine as the major issue dominating transatlantic relations at the moment. China's not going to go away. It's an issue.
And just to follow up on that, when we interviewed Jack Straw on this podcast, former Foreign Secretary, we asked him if he thought it was possible for Labour to craft an ethical foreign policy, because that's something that a lot of Labour people and progressives talk about. He thought the idea was nice, but he said it was really difficult to do in reality. What do you think about that concept of an ethical foreign policy?
Well, Robin Cook, when he became Foreign Secretary, famously talked about an ethical foreign policy. There's two ways of looking at it. One is ethics are important, morality is important. The discussion on Gaza is very much phrased in those terms, but it's an ethical dilemma often as much as being simple. The basic problem with an ethical foreign policy is that you have to deal with countries that have practices you don't like. It inevitably leads to accusations of hypocrisy. Take Saudi Arabia, and I say this not just because I support Newcastle United. You've got a country that's really important to the international economy, to the energy markets, to stability in the Middle East and so on. Yet it's hard to cheer on its domestic policies and human rights issues, but you have to deal with it. And that's part of this question when you talk about, again, the so-called global south. Is a lot of these countries are autocracies, they're corrupt, they have dubious practices, but they're important. So that's the problem with foreign policy. That's why people talk about realism in foreign policy. So you've got to have ways of talking about that while still saying, as far as we can, we'll act according to your principles, according to our principles.
If you've got any thoughts, reflections, or ideas to share about this episode, you can join the team behind the Power Test for our weekly post-match analysis, the debrief, which this week is happening on Monday the 29th at 12 o'clock.
Send us a Twitter DM if you'd like to get involved in the discussion and bring your brains. I mean, looking back to the last Labour government, obviously Robin Cook famously resigned over the Iraq war. And Iraq is sort of a reminder, I guess, that the things that you end up having to deal with on foreign policy are not necessarily the things you thought you were going to have to deal with. Labour had 9/11 and Iraq. Cameron had Syria and Libya. None of those were ones where we came out doing brilliantly well. But going back to sort of that moment on Iraq and how Blair dealt with Iraq, you spent a very long time on the Iraq inquiry throughout most of my 20s, I think. What are the lessons for Starmer, who opposed the Iraq war at the time, but as Prime Minister and his team, from that inquiry in terms of how they should deal with crises as they emerge?
The problem with Iraq, one of them, as Blair said, is he believed it. I mean, he thought it was the right thing to do. It comes out as an ethical question because so many people died in the aftermath, but it was also a prudential question of foreign policy. The net result of Iraq was to strengthen Iran regionally, leave Iraq quite weak and divided, and undermine the credibility of US and UK foreign policy. So even on realist terms, there were grounds to criticise what happened. When we started on the Iraq inquiry, and I was asked what was going to be the main lesson, was obviously don't do it again. But what the it was, I think, intervene in a country in which you were bound to be toppling the regime without a clear idea about what was going to replace it. And that was the problem with Libya as well. So this is the way my realism, if you like, in foreign policy works. It's just asking questions about what next, what follows. What actually do you think you're going to create here? And those were the questions which were raised early on in the Iraq discussions. Everybody was worried about, but in the end, they decided to postpone them because the immediate problem, having made the commitment to deal with Saddam and to stick as close as possible to the Americans was to do that without thinking about what stages would follow. If you frame the issue as pragmatic rather than purely ethical, then you've got a way of having a proper debate.
Do you think, despite the pain of Iraq and the trauma of Iraq and people saying we must learn the lessons from Iraq, do you think that much has really changed in terms of how any administration, and this would include a future Labour administration, handles these big decisions? Because to me, and I think to many of our listeners, the feeling will be that the natural default position for anybody in power, and I accept what you say about David Cameron, and he has actually done quite a good job. Jack Straw said on my programme Through Gritted Teeth, he thought David Cameron was doing a good job. But when it comes down to it, the signals that it's really important to send out in politics is always that Britain is in lockstep with America. That does not seem to have changed despite Iraq. Will that always be the default position?
I think it is. I mean, that's a starting point, I think, for any government. If you just look at defence and leave aside the nuclear area, very little of what we do, we can do without the Americans, including the carriers and the F-35s and aircraft and so on. When the US doesn't have a project that the UK can share, we sort of seem at a loss in foreign policy. That's why AUKUS and things like that have been seized upon in part by the government to show that this alliance is still a strong factor. Without the Americans, we're obviously less important.
Before we finish, I wanted to ask you about one other potential flashpoint that Labour might find themselves having to deal with, which is China and Taiwan. At the moment, there's sort of a growing sense of concern about what China might do to Taiwan, but no sort of specific action that they've taken to sort of precipitate anything. But what do you see as being the risk there, or the level of risk, and what would be the most likely way for it to manifest itself?
The thing about Taiwan is, in part, it's in the hand of the Taiwanese, that if they stick with the status quo, in which they still accept in principle, if not very much in practice, that it's all one country that happens to have been divided in the late 1940s, then that doesn't trigger a crisis. If they said we're now independent, completely independent from China, President Xi would be almost required to act. Then the other question is whether Xi at some point thinks his legacy has to be the complete reunification of Taiwan with China, which is a heck of a risk for him to take. And one hopes that Ukraine has demonstrated that these plans aren't as straightforward as he might imagine. And he's got other problems, big economic problems at home to deal with. I think the most likely trigger would be a change in Chinese policy. I think the Taiwanese understand exactly their situation. There's limits to what we could do. The thing is, if the crisis emerged, it would probably emerge as a blockade in the first instance. And I think there would be some expectation that allies would join in breaking a blockade, in freedom of navigation issues and so on. So it could be a test. There's an assumption that this test might come earlier with Trump than if we stay with Biden, who's been trying, I think, to sort of calm down relations on the security side with China while still pressing on the economic side. But Trump, who has got no interest in wars, really has an interest in high tariffs. I think people underestimate the risks of major trade wars with Trump. That, I think, would be as much of a test as the security side.
And Lawrence, just pivoting back to the UK, what do you think about the mindset of a future Labour administration on defence issues? Because Labour has not historically spoken about this a lot. It's had a lot of issues in terms of party management, but you are seeing Keir Starmer wanting to be very confident in this area. John Healey's been talking about it more. David Lammy has been talking about it more. But what do you think the sort of psychology will be of the Labour Party coming in, particularly when spending will be very tight? There'll be huge pressures from all departments wanting more money. We've got councils on the brink of collapse. The NHS needs more money. Labour's talking a good game on defence, but what do you think they'll actually do, and how comfortable will they be to actually put some serious investment in it and spend some political capital on it?
I don't think they'll change the current plans. Historically, Labour governments have had major defence reviews which have cut back on defence. The Blair government, their defence review actually was more ambitious. It didn't quite fund it enough, but it wasn't just simply a Treasury-led review, which is how the reviews in the 60s and the 70s were. If you look back, they start off wanting to keep defence spending high, or as it is, and then when the economic crisis comes at some point in the government, defence gets hit. They were the Treasury-led reviews. And that could easily happen again. It wouldn't surprise me. But at the moment, defence isn't as controversial as it might have been in the past. I think foreign policy issues might be controversial, but not particularly defence itself. I would hope that they would not just concentrate on showing that they support defence and support the armed forces, but have a pretty hard look at how we organise the defence budget, how we do our long-term planning, because no government, for as long as I can remember, and I can remember quite a long way back, has ever managed to get a proper grip on this question. Defence projects always seem to get out of control. And if it is Healy, he's been around for a while talking to people on these issues, so I'm not pessimistic about his grasp of the issues. And Labour have had some pretty impressive, defence secretaries in the past. With Dennis Healy, with George Robertson, and so on. They have a capacity to get to grip with some of these issues, and they've shown that in the past. But that, I think, is as important as just saying we support defence and we'll keep spending at current levels.
Right. We're asking in this series everyone to nominate someone that can be dead or alive, real or fictional, to Keir Starmer's first cabinet. I think you need to nominate either a foreign secretary or a defence secretary, given the theme of the episode. So who are you putting in there?
Sam, stop telling your dad what to do. He can nominate who he likes.
Well, it'd be a bit odd if he puts in the culture secretary after this episode.
I could nominate you.
Yes. Okay, that's a bridge too far, Lawrence. That's enough. Stop it.
I like that idea.
Oh, honestly.
Oh, goodness knows where I'd put you. The one I had in mind, I was thinking, in my time, I've known quite a lot of some of the more serious Labour politicians of the past. Actually, I decided on Roy Jenkins as a reforming Home Secretary, which I think we could do with. Genuine integrity, not a bad chancellor, and with interest in what Healy called a hinterland away from politics. I mean, if it was a former defence secretary, then Healy, or for that matter, George Robertson, who's obviously still around, it would be great to see George back. But a figure from the past, Jenkins.
And of course, was also a European commissioner. So
he also split away from the Labour Party to form the SDP, so that may count against him.
What issue do you think Labour should be talking about more that isn't getting enough airtime now?
I was trying to think about this one. We talk about we've talked a lot about defence. We haven't talked about the Foreign Office, or the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, as it is now known. It doesn't cost a lot, has been cut quite a bit over the past. It's had some, shall we say, strange foreign secretaries in recent times. I think we need diplomacy now. If you're claiming you want international influence and to be taken seriously, that's one of the means by which you do it. So I'd like to see a lot more attention given to diplomacy, how we do it better. There's been this report on the Foreign Office, which is all about branding, as far as largely. But I don't think it's an issue of branding. I think it's much more of what sort of diplomatic initiatives you think you can take. So that's a bit niche, but one I would concentrate on.
And finally, what's the one test you'd set for Starmer and the Labour Party to prove that they're in power to change Britain for the better?
This isn't particularly a policy commitment, but it goes back to the discussion we were having on ethical foreign policy and so on. It's the ability to talk in terms of trade-offs. I just find it very frustrating in politics that things always like to be presented as if there was only one possible choice that you could take. It was the right thing to do and so on. Actually, these things have to be weighed and there are many considerations. And if you want intelligent discussion of politics and actually to bring people along with you on the choices you've made, you should explain the complexity of choices more. Now, there's a limited public appetite for too much complexity, but you ought to be able to manage a certain amount. I think we had that very much dogging the whole Brexit debate. Was either side unwilling to contemplate decent arguments that the other side might have that have to be addressed. So this is probably rather an old academic's wish for proper conversations, but I think it is a test of good leadership to be able to explain why you've taken your decision.
But what we've been doing at the moment hasn't really worked in terms of just saying there was no alternative.
No, I hate that. And as with it was the right thing to do when you've obviously screwed up.
Well, Lawrence, we've come to the end of our time. We've had a very nuanced discussion. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and we have loved getting all the gossip on wee Sam and all the cheek he used to give his teachers at school. I imagine him threatening to turn the nursery into an academy at the age of and doing some kind of renationalisation of the train set when he was in.
Certainly that.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you are not a member of the Power Test crew, you can head to thepowertest.co.uk or thepowertest.substack.com. You'll get episodes ad-free and early before anyone else. And there's also an exclusive chance to be part of the podcast and lots more. Also, do get involved with us if you've got any questions or comments or ideas you'd like us to explore. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us on pod@thepowertest.co.uk. You can also get involved on social media as well.
And we've also got our brand new YouTube channel, which is Power Test Pod, and you can find clips on there. The Power Test only exists because of the amazing support from you, our members, and our supporters. And we're also delighted to have the backing of some brilliant organisations like the Future Governance Forum, which is providing intellectual and practical infrastructure vital to the revival of progressive government in the UK, and the Centre for Progressive Policy, a think tank championing inclusive economic growth. We're also really glad to have support from the Institute for Global Change, who provide us with exceptional research and briefings, and also partner with the fantastic Labour List, bringing to life many of the issues, themes and discussions we're covering on the pod.
Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. Ad-free listening is available on Amazon Music for all the music plus top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/news ad free. That's amazon.com/news ad free to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Need new glasses or want a fresh new style? Warby Parker has you covered. Glasses start at just $95, including anti-reflective, scratch-resistant prescription lenses that block 100% of UV rays. Every frame's designed in-house with a huge selection of styles for every face shape. And with Warby Parker's free home try-on program, you can order 5 pairs to try at home for free. Shipping is free both ways, too. Go to warbyparker.com/covered to try 5 pairs of frames at home for free. warbyparker.com/covered.
Hey, it's Paige DeSorbo from Giggly Squad. High quality fashion without the price tag. Say hello to Quince. I'm snagging high-end essentials like cozy cashmere sweaters, sleek leather jackets, fine jewelry, and so much more. With Quince being 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And they partner with factories that prioritize safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. I love that. Luxury quality within reach. Go to quince.com/style to get free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. Quince.com/style.